The city breathed in the rain. Wet sidewalks glistened under streetlights, reflecting the red and blue neon of bars and late-night diners. It was a Monday, the kind of night that felt like the weekend had never existed. Inside the Gilded Note, the air was different. It was warm, smelling of old wood, garlic, and the faint, sweet hint of expensive whiskey. Low, smoky jazz played from hidden speakers, a background hum to the sound of clinking glasses and the low murmur of conversations. People sat in booths of dark green leather, their faces softened by the glow of small table lamps. This was a place for people who had arrived, or at least could pretend they had for the night. She moved among them, a figure in a uniform of black and white, a simple white shirt, a black apron tied neatly at her waist, black trousers that whispered as she walked. Her name was Chloe. To the customers, she was a function, a pair of hands to bring a menu, a patient smile to take an order, a swift, quiet presence to clear away the empty plates. They saw the tray balanced on her palm, the way she navigated the crowded floor without bumping a single chair. They did not see the rest. They did not see how her eyes, a quiet shade of gray-green, would sometimes drift past the wine list she was offering, past the customer's face, to settle on the far corner of the room. There, on a low stage barely bigger than a rug, sat the piano, a grand piano, its dark wood polished to a mirror shine, catching the soft light and holding it like a secret. It was the soul of the room. Even when silent, they did not see her hands. When she placed a water glass on the table, her fingers, long and slender, would set it down without a sound. When she wrote an order on her notepad, her grip on the pen was firm, precise, and if you looked very, very closely, which no one ever did, you might see the slight, unusual ridges on the pads of her fingers. Not the rough calluses of hard labor, but the smoother, firmer pads of skin worn by repetition of a different kind. The manager, a kind man with tired eyes, called her a good one. Reliable, he meant she showed up on time, never complained about the late hours, and could handle the difficult tables with a calm grace. What he didn't know was that her life was split cleanly down the middle, like two movements in a piece of music that hadn't yet found its bridge. By day, her world was small and focused. It was a fourth-floor walk-up apartment with a fire escape that groaned in the wind. The main room was dominated, not by a sofa or a television, but by an electric keyboard. It was a decent one, but it had seen better days. The surface was worn where her fingers met the keys, and the sustain pedal sometimes stuck. Next to it, on a metal stand, sat piles of sheet music: Chopin, Rachmaninoff, Beethoven sonatas, the pages filled with her own penciled notes, circles, and reminders. A metronome sat silent, a sentinel waiting for its duty. In this room, Chloe wasn't a waitress. She was a student, a preparer, a woman fighting a silent war. The battlefield was the music, and the enemy was time. Every hour spent here was an hour earned by the night shift at the Gilded Note. The tips in the jar on her counter weren't for new clothes or a night out. They were counted, folded, and destined for the imposing stone building across town, the conservatory. Every dollar was a step closer to the tuition for a single class, a master workshop, a chance to learn from the teachers behind those heavy doors. The dream was not to be famous. It was simpler and harder than that. It was to be legitimate, to be seen as a musician, not just a girl who could play. The piano at the Gilded Note represented everything she was working toward. It was a real instrument, with a heart and a history in its strings. She had never touched it. It wasn't hers to touch. Her instrument was the one in her apartment. Her role here was to serve. Back in the present, a man at table 7 raised his empty glass, shaking it slightly. She was there in a moment. "Another one, sir?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. "Yeah, and make sure it's chilled properly this time," he said, not looking up from his phone. "Of course," she said, taking the glass. As she walked to the bar, her free hand, hanging by her side, flexed subtly. The fingers curled and uncurled, a phantom exercise, running through a difficult passage from a piece she was learning. Asterisk, third finger over the thumb on the arpeggio. Asterisk, she thought. Asterisk, smooth, not a jump. Asterisk. At the service station, as she waited for the drink, one of the other servers, a guy with a quick smile who always talked about his band, nudged her. "You okay? You seem a million miles away." She gave a small smile. "Just tired. Monday." "Heard that," he said, grabbing a tray of desserts. She wasn't just tired. She was storing it all away. The smell of the food, the patterns of the conversations, the way the light fell on the piano's lid. It was all fuel. Sometimes, when the room was loud and she was in the back filling condiments. She would close her eyes and hear the music in her head perfectly. She could feel the weight of the real piano keys, imagine the vibration of the notes in the air. It was a secret comfort, a promise she made to herself. The night wore on. A couple celebrated an anniversary with champagne. A group of business people argued good-naturedly over a contract. Chloe moved through it all, efficient and invisible. She cleared a table where a woman had been crying, arranging the empty wine glasses on her tray with a quiet respect. She brought extra bread to a family with a fidgety child, offering a quick, understanding smile to the grateful parents. Each interaction was a small, human moment. She liked these moments. They were real. They were different from the solitary, sometimes frustrating, communion with her keyboard at home. Here, life happened in all its messy, noisy glory right in front of her. She was part of its current, even if just as an observer. Finally, the clock ticked past the last call. The customers began to drift out into the damp night, their laughter fading into the city's hum. The cleanup began. Chloe wiped down tables, the citrus scent of the cleaner cutting through the evening smells. She stacked chairs, the legs scraping softly on the wooden floor. As she worked, she found herself near the stage. The piano seemed larger in the empty room, a sleeping giant. She allowed herself to walk up the single step. She didn't touch it. She just stood there, looking at the perfect curve of its side, the elegant lettering of its brand name. The manager walked by, counting the night's cash in a metal box. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, not stopping. "It is," she whispered. "Heard the guy who tunes it say it's got a beautiful action. Like butter," he said. And then he was gone into the back office. Chloe looked at her hands. Asterisk like butter asterisk. She curled her fingers into her palm, feeling the strength there, the memory of the day's practice. For a fleeting second, she imagined what it would feel like, not to play a few notes, but to really play to let the music she carried inside her out into this room, through this magnificent instrument. But the moment passed. She was just a waitress. The piano was for the professionals who were booked on Friday and Saturday nights, people with names in the arts section of the newspaper. She turned away, picked up her tray of cleaning supplies, and headed back to the kitchen. Her shift ended. She untied her apron, hung it on her assigned hook, and pulled on a worn, comfortable jacket, saying a quiet goodnight to the closing staff. She pushed open the heavy door and stepped into the cool, rainy air. The walk to the bus stop was quiet. The city had settled into its late-night rhythm. She replayed the night in her head, the orders she'd gotten right, the tip she'd forgotten to pick up from table 4 she'd get it tomorrow, the feel of the polished tables under her cloth, and always, the image of the piano. She got on the nearly empty bus, found a seat by the window, and leaned her forehead against the cool glass. The dreams in her head were loud, full of soaring music and bright stage lights. But the reality of her life was the quiet hum of the bus engine, the ache in her feet, and the knowledge that in a few short hours, she would be back at her keyboard, working, always working, to bridge the gap between the two. The story of her life was held in that tension, a quiet prologue waiting for its first, real chord. The next Friday night at the Gilded Note had a different energy. The air buzzed with a louder, more self-assured kind of noise. The weekend crowd was in, and they wore their money more openly, sharp suits, dresses that glittered, loud, confident laughter that cut across the room. At the very center of it all, holding court at his regular table like a king on a throne, was Charles Vanderbilt. Everyone in the city's service industry knew of him, or knew someone who did. He was a real estate developer, a man whose name was on half the new glass towers downtown. In his late 50s, he had the look of someone who had won at life and wanted you to know it. His smile was wide, but it rarely reached his eyes, which were a cool, assessing blue. He enjoyed an audience, and tonight he had 3 younger associates who hung on his every word, and a couple who seemed to be trying to impress him. Chloe had been aware of his table all evening. They were what the staff called a high-maintenance, high-reward group. They ordered the most expensive items without looking at the right side of the menu, sent back a bottle of wine because it was a fraction too warm, and required constant attention. She moved to and from their table with silent efficiency, replacing napkins, bringing fresh ice buckets, clearing plates with a swiftness that left no room for complaint. She was a ghost in black and white, which was exactly how she preferred it on a night like this. The trouble began near the end of their meal. Vanderbilt was telling a story about a business rival, his voice carrying, "And I told him, if you can't appreciate the craftsmanship, the sheer art asterisk of the deal, then you belong in the minor leagues. Some people only understand price tags, not value. His friends laughed on cue. His eyes, scanning the room, landed on Chloe as she approached to clear the dessert plates. "Ah, our silent sentinel," he said, his voice suddenly including her, making her part of the show. "You've been remarkably attentive. What's your name?" "Chloe, sir, Chloe, a good, classic name." He leaned back, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Tell me, Chloe, you work here night after night, surrounded by all this." He made a lazy gesture that took in the dark wood, the art on the walls, the grand piano on the stage. "Do you develop a taste for it? For the finer things?" She kept her expression neutral, polite. "It's a beautiful restaurant, sir." "That's not what I asked." His smile tightened. "Take that piano, for instance. A beautiful Steinway. I hear they bring in a specialist from out of state just to tune it. Costs more than your monthly rent, I'd wager." A titter went around his table. "When you look at it, what do you see? An instrument? Or just a very large, very expensive piece of furniture?" The question hung in the air, ugly and deliberate. It wasn't curiosity. It was a test, a setup. He was drawing a line between himself and his friends, the people who understood value, and her, the person who merely cleaned up around it. Chloe felt a flush creep up her neck. She knew this game. She'd seen versions of it before, where a certain kind of person needed to feel bigger by making someone else feel small. She met his gaze, her gray-green eyes steady. "I see a piano, sir." His eyebrows went up, as if her simple answer was a challenge. "Just a piano? No appreciation for its history, its tone, the artistry it represents?" He sighed, a theatrical sound of disappointment. "You see, this is what I mean. True appreciation is a rare commodity." He looked at his companions. "It can't be taught to just anyone." A hard knot formed in Chloe's stomach. The insult wasn't just to her. It felt like an insult to every hour in her tiny apartment, to every sheet of music marked with her sweat, to the very sound she dreamed of making. The piano wasn't furniture to her. It was a cathedral, a battlefield, a home. But saying that here, to this man, would only give him more ammunition. She simply nodded, wanting the moment to end. "Will there be anything else, sir?" But Charles Vanderbilt was enjoying himself. The night needed a crescendo. He pulled a thick, leather billfold from his inside jacket pocket. With slow, deliberate movements, he extracted several large bills. He held them out to her, not placing them on the table, forcing her to take them from his hand. "For your diligent service," he said, the emphasis making the tip feel like a slap. As her fingers closed on the money, he didn't let go immediately. His cool eyes held hers. Then, he raised his voice again, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. They had already gone quiet, sensing drama. "I have an idea," he announced, a spark of cruel inspiration in his eyes. "Let's have a little demonstration of appreciation. Chloe, you clearly work hard. You're a good waitress. But let's see if you can engage with the art here, not just the chores." He pointed a manicured finger at the grand piano. "Go on, play something for us. Let's see if you've picked up anything working in a place like this. Give us a little tune." The silence that followed was absolute. The soft jazz from the speakers seemed to fade away. Every eye in the section was on her. His friends wore smirks of anticipation. The couple looked uncomfortable. At a nearby table, an older woman with kind eyes looked down at her lap. Pained. Chloe stood frozen, the crisp bills feeling like lead in her hand. This was her worst fear made real. Not just being unseen, but being seen only for mockery. The piano was her sanctuary, not a prop for a rich man's joke. Playing a little tune on it would be a desecration of everything it meant to her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped rhythm. The manager, alerted by the silence, appeared at the edge of the room, his face pale with anxiety. He took a half step forward, ready to intervene, to apologize, to offer a free drink, to do anything to smooth things over. But something in Chloe shifted. The fear didn't disappear, but it was met by something hotter and fiercer. It was a spark of pure, defiant anger. This man thought he could buy a piece of her dignity for the price of a few bills. He thought the music in her was a party trick he could command. He saw the uniform and thought that was all there was. She looked from his smug face to the piano. The stage light was off, leaving it in semi-darkness. But the polished wood seemed to gleam with its own inner light, calling to her. It was a terrible risk. She could stumble. She could freeze. She could prove him right in front of everyone. But if she walked away now, she would always be the waitress who was too scared to touch the piano. The music inside her would feel like it had been locked away by a man like Charles Vanderbilt. Slowly, deliberately, she placed the stack of money on the table in front of him. She didn't slam it. She just set it down, a quiet, deliberate act that made his smile falter for a second. Without a word, she reached for the knot of her apron. Her fingers, which had felt clumsy a moment before, worked the tie with sure, practiced movements. She pulled the apron over her head, folded it neatly once, and placed it on the back of an empty chair at a neighboring table. The entire room watched, breath held. The manager stopped, unsure what was happening. Charles's smirk returned, wider now. He thought she was quitting. He thought he'd won. Chloe didn't look at him again. She turned and began to walk toward the stage. The sound of her practical, non-slip shoes on the wooden floor was the only sound in the world. With each step, the noise of the restaurant, the weight of the stairs, the heat of her own embarrassment began to fall away. A strange calm settled over her. It was the same focus she found in her apartment when a difficult passage finally clicked into place. The path was clear. There was only the walk, and then the piano. She reached the single step up to the stage and took it. She approached the bench, her reflection growing clear in the piano's glossy black side. For a fleeting second, she saw the waitress, the white shirt, the wary eyes. Then she sat down. The bench was different, higher than hers at home. She adjusted it smoothly, her movements instinctive. She opened the key cover. The ivory keys seemed to glow in the dim light. The crowd was a silent, shapeless mass behind her. Charles Vanderbilt was just a man at a table. She placed her hands on the keys. The touch was cool and solid, the action perfect and responsive. Asterisk like butter asterisk, the tuner had said, it was. She closed her eyes, took one deep, silent breath, and let the outside world vanish. In the silence, Charles leaned over to his friend and whispered, just loud enough to be heard by several tables. This should be pathetic. Chloe's shoulders relaxed, her fingers curved, and she began to play. The first sound was not a melody. It was a low, resonant chord from the left hand, a deep and questioning note that seemed to vibrate up from the floorboards, through the bench, and into the very bones of the room. It was a sound of weight and history. Before it had even faded, the right hand answered, not with a simple tune, but with a cascade of notes, clear and bright like water over stones, tumbling down into a second, more complex chord. The smug whisper Charles had just delivered hung in the air, now clashing violently with the reality of the sound. His smile didn't just fade, it was wiped clean. His head tilted slightly, as if he was trying to reconcile the woman in the waitress uniform with the authority of those opening notes. Chloe was gone. The person on the bench was someone else entirely. Her posture had changed. Where before she had carried the slight stoop of someone trying to be unnoticed, she now sat tall, her back straight but not stiff, her arms moving from a powerful, relaxed core. Her eyes were open, but they didn't see the restaurant. They were fixed on a point somewhere inside the music, watching the architecture of it being built note by note in her mind. The piece was Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. It was not a little tune. It was a story, a storm, a heartbreak, and a revolution poured into sheets of music. It was a piece that advanced pianists studied for years, often failing to capture its soul. It demanded technique, yes, lightning-fast arpeggios, thunderous chords, delicate trills that had to sound like sobs, but more than that. It demanded a deep, vulnerable understanding. It demanded a life lived, and in her life, Chloe had found it. The long hours of lonely practice weren't just in her fingers, they were in her bones. The frustration of a passage that wouldn't yield, the quiet joy of a phrase finally sung the way she heard it in her head, the ache of wanting something so badly it felt like a physical hunger. All of it lived inside her. And now, for the first time on an instrument worthy of it, she let it out. The music began to unfold. It was lyrical at first, a wandering, sorrowful melody that seemed to speak of lost things. Her left hand provided a rocking, gentle accompaniment, a heartbeat under the song. At a corner table, the older woman who had looked away in pity now looked up, her hand unconsciously moving to her throat. Her eyes were wide, glistening. She knew this piece. She had heard it in concert halls. This was not what she had expected to hear tonight. Behind the bar, the young server who had asked if Chloe was okay earlier in the week froze, a glass halfway to the dishwasher. His mouth hung open. He knew she was quiet, that she had a seriousness about her. But this was like discovering a nuclear reactor in a broom closet. He slowly put the glass down, not daring to make a sound. The manager stood rooted by the kitchen door, his clipboard dangling forgotten at his side. All his worries about a scene, about an angry VIP, evaporated. He was listening, truly listening. He'd heard the weekend pianists, the competent jazz trios. This was different. This wasn't background music. This was a command to stop everything and pay attention. Charles Vanderbilt's table was a still life of shattered expectations. His associates had lost their smirks. One had his elbows on the table, leaning forward, his head cocked. Another simply stared, his fork resting in an uneaten bite of cake. The couple were holding hands tightly, as if the music was a wave they needed to anchor against. And Charles himself? The color had drained from his face. His initial shock had curdled into a dawning, uncomfortable comprehension. He was a man who was used to knowing the price of everything. He could look at a building and see its cost per square foot, its potential revenue. He could look at a person and make a swift assessment of their utility, their social value. But this defied his arithmetic. The sheer, undeniable quality of what he was hearing was a fact, a towering fact that made his earlier mockery look not just cruel, but stupid. He had tried to price a diamond by weighing the cardboard box it came in. The music began to swell. The gentle lament grew more urgent, the phrases climbing higher, the chords beneath them richer and more troubled. Chloe's body moved with it, not with wild gestures, but with the natural, economic motion of someone channeling a force. A slight sway of her shoulders on a deep bass note, a subtle lean into a tender phrase. Her fingers, those same fingers that had just been clearing his dessert plate, were now a blur of controlled motion, crossing over and under each other with impossible grace, striking keys with pinpoint accuracy and then leaping away to find the next. She hit a series of powerful, declarative chords, each one ringing out like a statement. Then, without pause, the music shifted again. It became fleeting, nervous, a flurry of whispering notes up in the high register, like leaves caught in a gust of wind. Her touch was so light it was almost ghostly, yet every note was distinct. A shiver of sound. A busboy, no older than 19, had crept out from the kitchen and now stood in the shadow of the doorway, a bus tub hugged to his chest. He didn't know classical music. He listened to hip-hop and electronic beats, but he felt this. He felt the story in it. He watched Chloe, this co-worker he'd maybe said hey to in passing, and he saw a kind of power he didn't have a name for. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was total, undeniable mastery. It was respect, earned not by money or threats, but by skill so deep it became something else. He found he was holding his breath. The ballade built towards its famous, furious finale. The tempo increased. The left hand launched into a relentless, galloping rhythm, a storm of dark, churning notes. Over the top, the right hand unleashed torrents of passion, angry, sorrowful, triumphant all at once. The piano was no longer just an instrument. It was the center of a hurricane. The sound filled every corner of the gilded note, vibrating in the glassware, humming in the light fixtures. Chloe's face was calm, but intense. A strand of hair had come loose from her neat ponytail and brushed her cheek. She didn't notice. Sweat glistened at her temples. This was the most physically demanding part. A 6-minute sprint that required every ounce of strength, memory, and heart. Her muscles burned, but it was a clean, familiar burn. This was what she had trained for. Not for him. For this moment. For the moment when the music would take over completely and there would be no waitress, no audience, no Charles Vanderbilt, only the next note. And the next, and the next, rushing towards the end. The final minute was a whirlwind, a cathartic explosion of sound. The chords came like hammer blows, each one resolving into the next with a terrifying, beautiful logic. She drove the tempo forward, pushing herself and the magnificent piano to their edge. And then, the last, precipitous run. A cascading fall down the keyboard, a breathless rush that dropped the listener off a cliff into two final, stark, devastating chords. Bang. A fist of sound. Bang. A silence that echoed louder than any noise. Her hands lifted, hovered for a second above the keys, and then came to rest in her lap. For a long, endless moment, there was nothing. The last chord seemed to hang in the air, refusing to dissipate. The room was a photograph. The busboy still clutched his tub. The older woman had a tear tracing a line down her powdered cheek. The manager's hand was over his own heart. At Charles Vanderbilt's table, no one moved. No one looked at each other. They all just stared at the stage, at the slight figure in the white shirt who had just dismantled their entire evening and rebuilt it as something they would never forget. The spell broke with a single, sharp sound. It was the sound of one person, at a table in the back, beginning to clap. Not a slow clap of irony, but a firm, solid, heartfelt clap of recognition. Then another person joined, and another. It wasn't an explosion of cheers, not yet. It was a wave of understanding, rolling from the back of the room to the front, as person after person came back to themselves and realized what they had just witnessed. The applause grew, layered, becoming thunderous, punctuated by whistles and a loud bravo from the older woman. Chloe blinked, slowly returning to the room. The sound of the applause washed over her, a physical thing. She turned slightly on the bench and looked out. She saw faces alight with excitement, with awe. She saw her co-worker behind the bar beaming, clapping so hard his hands must have hurt. Her gaze traveled, almost against her will, to the center table. Charles Vanderbilt was not clapping. He was sitting perfectly still, his hands flat on the tablecloth on either side of his untouched drink. He was looking right at her, but his expression was unreadable. The arrogance was gone. The mocking glint was gone. What was left was something hollow, something stunned and stripped bare. In the roaring approval of the crowd, he was an island of utter silence. He had wanted to be the center of attention, and now he was utterly invisible. A small, quiet breath escaped Chloe's lips. It wasn't a smile of triumph. It was something softer, more profound. It was the feeling of a door, long locked, finally swinging open. She stood up. Her legs felt a little shaky, but they held. She gave the room a small, humble bow, just a dip of her head and shoulders. The applause swelled even louder. As she straightened, she didn't look at Charles again. The victory wasn't over him. It was for the music, which had finally been heard. It was for herself, who had finally been seen. The walk back from the stage felt entirely different from the walk to it. The crowd was with her now, their energy lifting her. She reached the chair where she had left H. The hallway behind the main dining room of the Gilded Note was a different world. The thick carpet swallowed sound, and the walls, lined with framed vintage concert posters, felt like they were pressing in. The roar of the applause became muffled, then distant, like a storm passing over. The only sound now was the frantic beating of Chloe's own heart in her ears and the soft whisper of her shoes on the carpet. She pushed through the door marked "Staff Only" and entered the back of House Chaos. It was all harsh fluorescent light, stainless steel, and the smell of bleach and old grease. For a moment, the contrast was so violent it made her dizzy. She leaned against the cool metal of a prep table, her fingers gripping the edge. The adrenaline that had been a pure, focused river while she played was now breaking apart inside her, leaving behind a trembling in her hands and a hollow feeling in her stomach. The kitchen door swung open and the busboy, the young one who had watched from the doorway, burst in. He stopped short when he saw her. His eyes were huge. He started, but couldn't find the words. He just shook his head, a grin spreading across his face. "You blew the roof off, man. You blew his stupid face right off." He mimed an explosion with his hands. Chloe managed a weak smile. "Thanks." Then others began to pour in. The server from the bar clapped a hand on her shoulder. "Girl, you have been holding out on us. That was insane." The head chef, a big man with a tattoo of a whisk on his forearm, gave her a solemn nod from across the room, a look of deep respect on his face. The manager poked his head in, his expression still one of stunned excitement. "We'll talk tomorrow, Chloe, seriously, tomorrow." Then he disappeared back to the front, probably to manage the buzzing crowd. The attention was warm, but it was also overwhelming. It was too much, too fast. She needed quiet. She needed to be nobody again, just for a minute, to let what had just happened settle into her bones. She slipped into the small, cramped staff bathroom and locked the door. The silence was immediate and complete. She looked at herself in the small mirror over the sink. Her face was pale. Her eyes looked too bright. The loose strand of hair still stuck to her damp cheek. She looked like someone who had just run a marathon or survived a car crash. She turned on the cold tap and splashed water on her face, the shock of it helping to ground her. What did you just do? She thought. The reality of it was beginning to seep in. She had played the ballade on that piano in front of a room full of people, and she had done it well. Not just well, she had done it right. The feeling of the keys, the response of the instrument, the way the music had flowed through her without a single moment of doubt or fear. It was the best she had ever played it, ever. A shaky breath escaped her, and then another. To her surprise, a single, hot tear rolled down her cheek, followed by another. They weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of release. It was as if a dam, built over years of quiet work, of swallowed pride, of being unseen, had finally burst. The music was out. It was free. And so, in a way, was she. After a few minutes, she dried her face, smoothed her hair, and took a deep, steadying breath. She had to finish her shift. That was the reality. Tips needed to be collected. Her station closed out. She left the bathroom and walked back to the main floor, her apron still folded in her hand. The dining room had changed. The energy was electric, but it was no longer focused on Charles Vanderbilt's table. He and his party were gone. Their table was already cleared, a busboy wiping it down. It was as if they had never been there. The victory felt clean, complete, but the rest of the room was alive. Patrons who had been ready to leave an hour ago were ordering more drinks, talking animatedly. Many of them smiled at her as she passed. A middle-aged man in a tweed jacket stopped her. "Excuse me, miss. That was a transcendent performance, truly. Do you perform publicly?" "Not yet," she said, the words feeling strange and new in her mouth. "You must," he said earnestly before moving on. She collected her tips from her other tables. The bills and coins felt insignificant now, just paper and metal. But they were still her rent, her food, her lifeline. She counted them methodically, the familiar routine calming her nerves. As she was finishing, the older woman from the corner table approached. Her eyes were kind and still held a trace of emotion. She took Chloe's hand in both of hers. Her hands were soft and cool. "My dear," she said, her voice low and warm. "I studied at the conservatory many years ago. I heard Horowitz play that piece. I never thought, in a place like this." She squeezed Chloe's hand. "You have a rare gift. Don't let anyone, make you hide it again." "That man," she glanced at the empty table with a dismissive frown. "He was a noise. You are the music. Remember that." Chloe felt a new lump form in her throat. She could only nod, unable to speak. The woman patted her hand and walked away, leaving Chloe standing there, holding the simple, powerful truth of those words. The closing duties felt surreal. Wiping down the same tables, stacking the same chairs, but everything was different. The piano on the stage was no longer a distant symbol. It was now a place of memory, of triumph. She caught herself looking at it often, a quiet sense of ownership blooming in her chest. Finally, it was time to go. She hung her apron on its hook for what she now knew, with a thrilling certainty, would not be the last time. But its meaning had changed. It was no longer a uniform of invisibility. It was a costume she had worn for one final, transformative act. She stepped out into the night. The city air was cool and smelled of rain. The usual tiredness was there in her muscles, but it was layered over with a buzzing, alive feeling. She didn't head for the bus stop right away. She just stood there, leaning against the brick wall of the building, letting the coolness of it seep into her back. She replayed it, not just the playing, but the walk to the stage, the feeling of the bills in her hand, the look on Charles Vanderbilt's face as the first chords rang out, that hollow, stunned silence where his arrogance had been. She didn't feel pity for him. She didn't feel hate. He was simply irrelevant. His opinion, his money, his attempt to shrink her world, it had all been rendered null and void by 8 minutes of truth. Told in music, a figure emerged from the shadows down the street, walking quickly. As he passed under a street lamp, she recognized him. It was one of Charles Vanderbilt's younger associates, the one who had been taking notes all night. He was alone, and he looked flustered. He seemed to be heading for a sleek, expensive car parked at the curb. He saw her standing there and stopped short. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He cleared his throat. For a second, it seemed like he might just get in his car and drive away. But then he took a few steps toward her. "Listen," he said, his voice tight. He wouldn't meet her eyes, instead looking at a point somewhere over her shoulder. "That was what you did in there. It was really something." He said it like it was a concession, pulled from him against his will. Chloe just waited, silent. He fumbled in his own jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. It was thick, creamy cardstock. He held it out to her. "Charles, Mr. Vanderbilt. He's on the board of the city's Arts Foundation. They have a grant program for emerging artists." He finally looked at her, his expression a complex mix of embarrassment and a dawning professional curiosity that was overriding his earlier loyalty. "You should apply, seriously, with a video of that. What you did in there." He was offering her a piece of the very world he and his boss belonged to, not as a servant, but as an artist. It was an apology, a peace offering, and an acknowledgement, all in one. Chloe looked at the card in his hand. She thought about the conservatory tuition, the mountain of debt she was staring down. This card could be a ladder, but taking it felt like accepting something from the world, on their terms. It felt like letting them back in. She reached out and took the card. Not eagerly, but slowly. She looked at the embossed letters, the fancy logo. "Thank you," she said, her voice flat. He nodded, looking relieved that the awkward interaction was over. "Yeah, okay. Well, good night." He turned and almost scurried to his car, the engine purring to life a moment later. Chloe looked down at the card in her hand. Then, with a calm, deliberate motion, she tore it in half, then in half again. She walked to a trash bin on the corner and dropped the pieces inside. The grant might exist. She might even find it on her own later, but she wouldn't take it as a consolation prize from that table. Her path forward would not begin with a favor from Charles Vanderbilt. She turned her face towards home, towards her small apartment and her worn keyboard. For the first time, the walk didn't feel like a retreat. It felt like a journey towards a future that had just become real. The piano in her apartment wasn't a poor substitute anymore. It was the training ground. The Gilded Notes piano was the stage, and she had just proven she belonged on it. She started walking, a new rhythm in her step. The rain began again, a light, misty drizzle that sparkled in the streetlights. She didn't hurry. She let it fall on her face, cool and clean, washing away the last traces of the old night, ready for whatever came next. The morning light that filtered through the window of Chloe's apartment felt different. It wasn't just the pale gray light of another city day. It held a charge, a quiet hum of possibility. She woke not to the usual heavy pull of exhaustion, but to a memory so vivid it was like a film playing behind her eyes. The feel of the Steinway's keys, the collective gasp of the room, the silence after the final chord. Her phone, face down on the floor by her mattress, buzzed insistently. She picked it up. There were messages, a few from co-workers, still buzzing from the night before. One from the manager, "Come see me at 3 p.m. today. No pressure, just talk," smiley face. And several from numbers she didn't recognize. One read, "Saw you play at the Gilded Note last night. My name is Thomas. I teach at the conservatory. Please call me when you can." Her thumb hovered over the screen. The conservatory. The words themselves felt like a key turning in a lock. She got up and made her cheap, bitter coffee, the familiar ritual grounding her. She sat at her worn keyboard, but didn't turn it on. She just looked at it. This instrument, with its chipped plastic and slightly stiff action, was her old friend. It had heard every mistake, every breakthrough, every moment of frustration and joy. It wasn't the enemy of the beautiful grand piano. It was the reason she had been ready for it. She placed her hands on the silent keys and felt a deep gratitude for its quiet service. The walk to the Gilded Note that afternoon felt nothing like her usual trudge to a shift. Her heart was a steady, hopeful drum, not a tired thud. She pushed open the heavy front door. The restaurant in daylight was an empty shell. Chairs were upturned on tables. The floor smelled of disinfectant, and sunlight cut dusty shafts through the quiet air. The grand piano on the stage looked both majestic and ordinary, just a piece of furniture again. But she knew its secret now. The manager was in his tiny office, surrounded by invoices. He looked up and his face broke into a wide, genuine smile. "Chloe, come in." Shut the door. She sat in the chair across from him. He didn't beat around the bush. "Last night was the single most extraordinary thing I've ever seen in my 15 years. Running this place," he said, leaning forward. "I had 3 people call this morning asking if the waitress pianist was playing again tonight. One guy offered to buy a whole table for next Friday if you were." He shook his head in wonder. "So, here's the offer. Friday and Saturday nights. 2 45-minute sets. You play what you want. We'll pay you 3 times your serving wage, plus a percentage of the bar take during your sets." And he paused for effect. "You never have to wait another table again. If you're here, you're the artist." The words hung in the small, cluttered office. It was everything she had needed, offered on a silver platter. Stability, respect, a stage, a real, paying audience. It was a lifeline thrown directly to her. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. "It's an incredible offer." He sensed a but before she even said it. "But," he asked, his eyebrows rising. She took a breath. "Can I think about it? Just for a day or 2? He looked surprised, then nodded slowly. "Of course. It's your call. But don't think too long. The crowd has a short memory." She left the office and, on an impulse, walked to the stage. She stepped up and sat at the piano again. In the silence of the empty room, she played a single, simple scale. The sound was still perfect. She closed the lid gently. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a promise to return. The real work began that evening. Back in her apartment, she returned the teacher's call. His voice was warm, excited. He had been there with a visiting colleague. He used words like polished technique and profound musicality. He invited her to play for him in one of the conservatory's practice rooms. Just an informal hearing, he said. But they both knew what it was, an audition. For the next 2 days, Chloe lived in a focused bubble. She practiced, but differently. It wasn't just repetition anymore. It was preparation for a specific future. She worked on the ballade, smoothing the edges she'd felt in her performance. She practiced other pieces, building a potential set list. She also sat for hours at her small table, a notebook open, making lists of pros and cons. The manager's offer was safe. It was a job, a good one, in a place that now felt like friendly territory. She could pay her bills, save a little, play for an appreciative audience. It was the obvious choice. The conservatory path was a cliff jump. The teacher's interest didn't mean a full scholarship. It meant an opportunity to try out, to possibly earn a spot, to enter a world of intense competition and staggering cost. It was the dream. But dreams were fragile and expensive. On the third morning, she knew she couldn't decide by hiding in her apartment. She needed to see it, to feel it. She put on her neatest clothes and walked across town to the conservatory. It was a grand, old stone building with high windows. She'd walked past it 100 times, always looking up with a kind of aching longing. Today, she walked up the wide front steps and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The inside was hushed. The air smelled of old books, lemon polish, and, faintly, of rosin and brass. The silence was not empty. It was thick with absorbed sound, the distant, muffled thump of a timpani, the warble of a vocalist running scales, the intricate weave of a string quartet bleeding from a closed door. It was the sound of work, of dedication, of hundreds of stories like hers all happening at once. She wandered, her footsteps echoing in a marble hallway lined with portraits of composers, their stern faces looking down. She found a doorway leading to a small auditorium. A student was on stage, a violinist, practicing a concerto with a pianist. They stopped, argued good-naturedly about a tempo, and started again. Chloe stood in the shadowed back row and watched. The student was brilliant, but also frustrated, striving. This was not a place of finished perfection. It was a workshop, a hospital for music, a place to get better, to be challenged, to be torn down and rebuilt by teachers who knew how. She thought of the gilded note, the applause, the tips, the warm certainty of it. She thought of playing the same beautiful music for a crowd that was there primarily to eat and drink. There was nothing wrong with that. It was an honest living, but it was a destination. This place, with its struggling students and its smell of ambition, was a road, a hard, uncertain, glorious road. She left the conservatory and walked, not really seeing the city around her. She found herself at a small park, sitting on a bench watching pigeons bicker over crumbs. An older man sat nearby, feeding them from a brown paper bag. He glanced at her, heavy thoughts. He asked, his voice raspy, "Just a choice," she said. "Ah," he nodded sagely, "the safe harbor or the open sea." "The funny thing is," he said, tossing a crust, "you can usually see the harbor from the sea, but you can never see the sea from the harbor." She looked at him, surprised by the simple truth of it. He just smiled and went back to feeding the birds. That evening, she met with the teacher, Thomas, in a small, soundproofed room at the conservatory. She played for him, not the ballade, but a Beethoven sonata. She played with all the focus she had, but without the desperate fire of that Friday night. This was a different kind of truth. He listened, his eyes closed, nodding occasionally. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You have the hands. You have the heart," he said. "What you need now is the framework, the discipline, the history, the theory to understand why what you feel works. And you need to be around other people who speak your language day in and day out. It will be the hardest thing you've ever done. You will doubt yourself constantly, but you will grow in ways you can't imagine." He explained a mentorship program, a work-study opportunity that would cover a significant part of the tuition. It was a path, steep and narrow, but clear. She walked home in the deepening twilight. The city lights began to blink on. She thought of the safe harbor, the warm lights of the gilded note, the immediate applause. She thought of the open sea, the stormy, challenging, boundless world of the conservatory. She stopped at a crosswalk, watching the traffic stream by, and she knew the harbor would always be there, but the sea was calling now. She had gotten a taste of what it was to truly be seen for her music. Now she needed to learn how to be worthy of that sight for a lifetime. The next morning, she called the manager. She thanked him from the bottom of her heart. She told him she would love to play at the Gilded Note occasionally, as a guest, on nights that didn't conflict with her studies. She heard the disappointment in his voice, but also understanding. "You'd be wasted here full-time, kid," he finally said. "Go be great." Then she called Thomas and accepted his offer. The following weeks were a whirlwind of paperwork, of selling a few prized possessions to make ends meet, of a last emotional shift at the restaurant where her co-workers threw her a small party. Her final act as an employee was not to clear a table, but to play one last short set for the staff. It was joyful and loud and full of love. On her first official day at the conservatory, she walked through those heavy doors not as a visitor, but as a student. She got lost twice finding her classroom. She sat in a theory lecture, her head swimming with unfamiliar terms. She was the oldest in many of her introductory classes. She felt out of place, behind, and utterly a live dot in the practice room assigned to her. There was a decent, though not perfect, upright piano. She placed her bag down and ran her fingers over the keys. It was B.